investigators are on the trail of a serial killer who's leaving behind a series of almost invisible clues. In Maine, police depend on a few paltry fibers to sew up a case against a deadly rapist. The evidence is in hand, but they have nothing to compare it against. Florida investigators confront a fast car, a fatal accident, an unlikely story. Can forensic scientists use fibers from the crash scene to find out what really happened? Tiny filaments, practically invisible to the naked eye, are the key to solving these crimes. In the lab, scientists can weave the truth from the shreds of evidence. In 1981, a peaceful hike in the suburbs of Atlanta, Georgia, ended with a grim discovery. The body of a young man was lying at the edge of a field. For Atlanta police, it was the kind of scene that was becoming all too familiar. For 21 months, more than 24 bodies had turned up in fields, empty lots, and less traveled roads. The victims were young African-American males. Some were children. Most were strangled. At first, the crimes were investigated routinely. But as the murder count climbed, it became clear a serial killer was on the loose. He would leave few clues in his deadly wake. Parents of the victims demanded answers. And as more bodies turned up, police assembled a task force to find a link among the murders and to trace every clue. But the murders continued. Lawmen from the surrounding area joined citizens, even psychics, in the search for victims and their killer. A reward fund reached $100,000, but no one came forward to claim it. Racial tensions grew as panic gripped this southern city. Assuming the crimes were racially motivated, police looked for a white male, and the outcry for justice in the African-American community grew deafening. As the death toll climbed past 20, investigators hoped it was only a matter of time before they caught the killer. But time was their enemy, and they had few clues. At the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, microanalyst Larry Peterson set his sights on the almost invisible clues known as trace evidence.
I began applying more or less full-time efforts into looking at the cases individually and also comparing them to see if they were related.
Peterson was counting on fiber evidence to be the common thread that bound killer and victims. By their nature, fibers are easy to pick up, hard to brush off. They provide a nearly invisible record of every place a person visits. By the same token, every victim was literally covered in hundreds of fibers, most of them meaningless. To find out which strands were important required a concentrated effort. Each fiber collected from one victim had to be visually compared against hundreds pulled from the next. Multiply that by 20 victims, and investigators were examining hundreds of thousands of fibers. The task could easily stretch into months.
It's hard to determine automatically what bits of material are important that could be from, let's say, a killer's environment, what bits of material is from the victim's own home, from places that they frequent.
Using a stereo microscope that renders the fiber evidence in 3 dimensions, Peterson analyzed fibers culled from the crime scenes and during autopsies. Their length, shape, and texture suggested some were from a household carpet, others were from an automobile.
I was still looking for any other kind of evidence that may link different cases together, in addition to the ones I had already found.
After scanning hundreds of samples, Peterson singled out fibers with similar characteristics. On most of the bodies, he kept coming across purple acetate fibers, as well as yellow-green fibers that appeared to be from a carpet. As the evidence began to accumulate, he needed more specialized microscopes. To see if they were from the same source, he placed the carpet fibers on a high-magnification comparison microscope. It allowed him to compare the fibers side by side. Their colors and shapes matched. Peterson was encouraged. Perhaps that was the link he needed. He now had proof that all the victims were connected in some way, and that they were probably killed by the same person. If he could figure out where the fibers came from, he could catch the killer. Fortunately, the fiber had an unusual structure. If he could locate its manufacturer, he'd be that much closer to solving the case. That required comparing the fiber against the hundreds of samples submitted by carpet manufacturers, an interminable and painstaking job that would add more weeks to the investigation. He couldn't do it alone. Hal Dedman, the FBI's master microanalyst, signed on to help.
My initial role was to assist the Georgia Crime Laboratory in attempting to identify these fibers, to see if the manufacturer of these fibers could be identified.
While the search for the elusive fiber wore on, young men and boys were dying. And Atlanta was scared. As the city's anguish continued, Hyde Post of the Atlanta Journal covered the story.
The mood of the city during most of the investigation was a real strong feeling of helplessness.
Desperate for leads, Atlanta police canvassed victims' neighborhoods and streets near where bodies were found. They questioned people door to door, looking for any piece of information that might help them. At night, patrol cars searched the neighborhoods looking for anyone suspicious. On the streets, police had few leads, but in the lab, microanalysts were getting closer to pinpointing an original source for the unique fiber. The media caught wind that investigators were using trace evidence to tie the Atlanta area murders together. But publishing the news didn't stop the killer. It only made him change his tactics.
Suddenly, instead of in the woods or dumped by the roadside, the bodies began to show up in water.
The victims found in the rivers were either nude or partially clothed. Was the murderer trying to eliminate fiber evidence from being traced back to him? Lawmen suspected as much. Without alerting the media, and armed with the knowledge that the killer was now disposing of the bodies in water, scores of police recruits staked out Atlanta's bridges. They were fishing for a murderer that had eluded them for 22 months. Week after week, the recruits would secretly assemble under the bridges to keep their vigil. For all their efforts, officers dubbed them trolls. All they could do was wait for the killer to strike again. Around 2 a.m. on May 22, 1981, the calm along the Chattahoochee River was broken by a splash in the darkness. The trolls waiting under the James Jackson Parkway Bridge sprang into action to find the cause. But they could not see what made the splash. They radioed to nearby officers, who intercepted a station wagon and questioned the driver. His name was Wayne Bertram Williams, a 23-year-old freelance photographer and self-proclaimed music promoter. Williams didn't fit the assumed profile of the killer. In fact, as a young black man, he was more likely to be a victim. Williams told police he was coming home from a nightclub where he went to hear a new act he was considering signing. As a matter of procedure, police searched his car, then took his name and address and sent him on his way. Two days later, the body of 27-year-old Nathaniel Cater surfaced in the Chattahoochee River, downstream from the James Jackson Parkway Bridge. Cater, a black male whom the medical examiners determined had been strangled, fit the profile of the victims murdered in the months before. He'd been dead an estimated 2 days. The trace evidence collected from Cater's body was sent to Peterson. 2 fibers had been extracted from the victim's hair. In structure, they matched those found on the other victims. But the color didn't match. It could have faded from the water, or it could have been a mismatch. But viewing the fibers under polarized light revealed the structure of the fibers to be identical. Police decided to take a second look at Wayne Williams. After an interview and background check, a picture of Williams developed. He was a pampered only child, a college dropout at age 19. No one had seen him at the club he said he was at the night police stopped him on the bridge. Caught in this one lie, his alibi crumbled. Williams now became their chief suspect. They obtained search warrants for his house and car. Williams, feeling he had been wrongly accused because of his race, held a news conference to proclaim his innocence. But he didn't allow the press to take pictures.
They openly said, "You killed Nathaniel Cater, and you know it, and you're lying to us." They said that.
Some members of the African American community also found it hard to believe that Williams could be considered a suspect.
I think it was very difficult for the community to believe that an African American might have committed these crimes, that an African American had gone about systematically killing other African Americans. There was no history of black serial killers. Serial killers is a middle-aged white guy thing, or seemed to have been, and this ran counter to that pattern.
In the early 1980s, DNA testing wasn't available yet. All that forensic investigators had to go on were these small fibers. The strands seemed to point to Williams' guilt. His house was covered with yellowish-green carpet. Peterson collected as many fiber samples as he could. He also collected dog hairs and fibers from a purplish bedspread and from the trunk liner and glove compartment of Williams' car. Inside these bags of evidence could lie the key to catching the murderer. Peterson was hopeful that fibers from Williams' house would match fibers from the victim's clothing.
Took the evidence back immediately to the laboratory that very evening and mounted some of the samples up to see, does this have any potential or not? Let's just kind of see right away.
The violet acetate, along with the green carpet fibers from Williams' home, matched the fibers found on nearly all of the victims so far. But as strong as that evidence seemed, it simply wasn't enough. To make their case, investigators faced a staggering challenge: to determine how many other people in Atlanta had the exact same carpet. Based on the fiber evidence, Wayne Williams now looked like a strong suspect in the Atlanta murders. But anyone else in Atlanta with the same taste in yellow-green carpeting would be equally suspect. Police needed more to go on. They needed to find out how much of that particular yellow-green carpet was installed in Atlanta's homes. So they dug much deeper. Microscopic analysis of the fiber structure helped identify their manufacturer. The carpet was made in the early 70s, but that particular shade was produced for just 1 year. A little more than 16,000 yards of the carpet had ever been sold in the Southeast. In Atlanta, the calculated odds that someone owned the same kind of carpet as Williams were less than 1 in 8,000. The evidence was stacking against Williams, but not nearly enough to win a conviction. To narrow the field, investigators compared automobile carpet fibers found on some of the victims to the rug in Williams' car.
It was estimated that approximately 1 out of 3,500 cars in the Atlanta, Georgia area might be expected to have a carpet fiber like that found on many of the victims that were linked to Wayne Williams.
Put another way, the victims would have had to randomly visit 3,500 cars plus nearly 8,000 homes in order to pick up both fibers. The odds of that happening randomly were 1 in more than 29 million. Add to that the purple acetate fiber from the bedspread, and it became nearly impossible that the victims could have picked up these 3 fibers someplace else. The numbers didn't lie. Williams was arrested. To forensic scientists, the fiber evidence was overwhelming. To a panel of jurors, it might be confusing.
We wrote a story at the beginning of the trial that the prosecution's strongest case, strongest evidence, could be contained in a thimble.
More than just Williams was on trial. Prosecutors knew that the science that led to his arrest would also be scrutinized. The defense would do everything it could to snarl their credibility.
If you do enough searches and you find another environment where there's that same green carpet, what are the odds that there will be an automobile that had the same floorboard carpeting, or that the family would possess the same blanket and bedspread and throw rugs and clothing items? That's really the key. That combination cannot exist.
On February 27, 1982, Wayne Williams was found guilty of killing 2 men. The jury deliberated 11 hours. 10 other murders were definitely linked to him during the trial, and the task force closed the books on 27 murder cases between 1978 and 1981, connecting them to Williams on the same fiber evidence. The Wayne Williams case was the first time a crime was solved solely on the basis of fibers. The amount and variety of fibers found on Williams' victims snared him in a net of evidence. But in a case in Maine, investigators had far less to catch a killer. November 30th, 1990 was a brutal day in northern Maine. On that day, a worker at the Cummings Concrete Corporation in Alton called police after discovering the body of a young woman. The victim was face down. She was nude except for the socks on her feet. The rest of her clothes were piled nearby. Police on the scene contacted Detective Ed Thorne of the nearby Bangor Police Department. They knew he was working on a month-old missing persons case, and the victim fit the description of the missing woman. The State Police Mobile Crime Lab was called in. Investigators were on the trail of a killer. Potentially important clues like tire tracks or footprints had to be quickly gathered before someone accidentally or intentionally destroyed the evidence. Maine State Police crime scene investigator Craig Hanley supervised collection of evidence. According to Hanley, the very act of arriving on a crime scene can compromise the minute evidence.
If the crime scene is not properly secured, we end up with contamination or inadvertent contamination, sometimes by the officers themselves. It's very important for us to interview the first responders and to find out exactly where they walked, what they touched, what they moved, and what they removed. And if they've done the job properly, they should have everything noted so they can explain this to us. There's nothing better than for a crime scene investigator to arrive on the scene and find it in a very good condition.
The scene's original condition was recorded on film, and notes were jotted down on paper. Soil samples and debris were collected. In a case that might hinge on microscopic evidence, there was no way of knowing what might become important. Investigators had two questions before them. Who was the victim, and who killed her? The body was taken to the medical examiner's office, where an autopsy was performed and a positive ID could be made. Her clothing and physical features matched those of 18-year-old Lisa Garland, the missing woman that Thorne had been searching for. She had been reported missing 1 month earlier. The medical examiner later confirmed her identification through fingerprints. Garland was last seen around 1 a.m. on October 27th, leaving the convenience store where she worked. She lived only a short distance away. Bangor Police Detective Ed Thorne had reason to believe that Garland arrived at her apartment after she left the store. What happened then is an open question.
From there, she would have walked or got a ride down to her residence, which is approximately 150 yards from the store. We know she arrived because her pocketbook, her keys to the house, some money, and all her belongings were there.
The keys and valuables found in her house led police to believe that she had not left on her own. After a month, Detective Thorne and his colleague Bob Cameron saw their missing persons case turned into a homicide. The autopsy revealed the victim had been raped and killed by a blunt force to her head. Most of her internal organs were intact, preserved by the cool weather. At the Maine State Crime Laboratory, forensic chemist Chris Montagna analyzed trace evidence collected from the crime scene. Most notably, the socks the victim was wearing at the time of her death. He was hoping they would hold some small clue to the killer's identity.
We knew that one of the key pieces of evidence that we're going to be looking at are these socks. I began to process the socks simply by doing a visual examination, seeing what I could find, if there was any hairs or fibers, grass, anything that might be from the environment of the perpetrator.
He found maroon fibers. Experience told him they were from the carpet of an automobile. In terms of clues, it wasn't much. But Montagna felt the entire case could hang by this one thread of evidence. In July 1991, a 15-year-old girl was riding her bike on a lonely road in York, Maine, more than 200 miles south of Bangor. A car slowly approached and forced her off the road. She fell into the grassy embankment. The driver got out of the car and dragged the girl into the woods. There, he raped her, stabbed her, and left her for dead. Amazingly, she survived. After her attacker left, she found her way to a neighbor's house where she called for help. At the York Police Department, she picked out her attacker from the mugshot file. The suspect was a convicted rapist named David Fleming, who had been released from prison just 9 months earlier. In a state as quiet as Maine, news of violent crime spreads fast. After months of chasing dead-end leads to find Lisa Garland's killer, Detective Thorne heard about the violent rape in York. Bangor police became interested in David Fleming. Just maybe he had something to do with Lisa Garland's death. In York, DNA taken from the rape victim matched Fleming's DNA. Fleming pleaded guilty to raping and assaulting the young woman in York. He was sentenced to 80 years. The Lisa Garland murder case was still open. Bangor detectives believed that if they could match Fleming's DNA to samples collected at the crime scene, they'd have their man. But the DNA would have to wait. In the early 1990s, DNA testing could take months. Today, it takes weeks. If police were to prove that David Fleming killed Lisa Garland, they would need to rely on more conventional evidence. In this case, carpet fibers extracted from David Fleming's car. The fibers were sent to chemist Chris Montagna. He compared them with the ones found 8 months earlier on Lisa Garland's socks. Montagna placed each fiber on a separate stage of a comparison microscope to analyze them side by side. With a few adjustments, he could see that the pattern of dark and light stripes in the fibers lined up. When laid end to end, the fibers looked like one continuous strand, indicating that they came from the same source. It looked like the breakthrough investigators needed. The match allowed detectives Thorne and Cameron to trace 8-month-old evidence back to David Fleming. Detective Bob Cameron understood the importance of the fiber evidence.
The fiber that was found on the victim's sock, that was matched to the carpeting on the vehicle that Fleming had been driving. And it narrowed it down considerably because the fiber that matched to the carpet in the car was the only year that they had put that color carpeting in those vehicles.
The results were now conclusive. The fibers matched. But would this single shred of evidence be enough to convince a jury beyond a reasonable doubt? Fortunately, an overlooked piece of evidence was found in the victim's body bag. It was a small chip of wood, hardly worth keeping. But Montagna noticed that it had been squared off, leading him to believe that the wood had been machined. Successful once with carpet fibers, Montagna asked the investigators to again comb through Fleming's car, to look this time for a speck of matching wood. Inside the trunk, covered by a large cloth, lay small hand-carved wooden boats. Fleming learned to craft wood during his previous prison stints. Montagna sent the chip and the boats for analysis. The results again looked bad for Fleming. The chip was made of white pine, and so were the model boats. The wood had all been machined the same way. Now there were two strong reasons to link Fleming to Lisa Garland. The fiber evidence and the wood chip showed that Garland was in Fleming's car. But none of this evidence proved that he raped and murdered her. Establishing that Fleming killed her would be much more difficult. He appeared to have an airtight alibi. Around the same time Lisa Garland disappeared, he was in the hospital with serious injuries. Lisa Garland was last seen alive when she finished her shift at the convenience store in Bangor around 1 a.m. on October 27th. At around 6 a.m. that same day, David Fleming was involved in a car accident that left him hospitalized for 2 weeks. Fiber evidence showed that Garland was in Fleming's car. But to prove he was her killer, detectives had to pinpoint exactly when she could have been there. Fleming would have had 2 chances to abduct Garland. The first was in the 5 hours between the time she disappeared and the time he had his accident. The second was the 2-week period between Fleming's release from the hospital and when Garland's body was found. An examination revealed that she was killed shortly after she was raped, but the cold weather had preserved her body and made it impossible to determine how long she'd been dead. Police knew she could not have been in Fleming's car while he was in the hospital and the car was being repaired. So if they could prove she was dead before Fleming was hospitalized, it would mean that Fleming was her killer. Police needed some way of narrowing the time frame. Bangor police learned that an aerial photo of the crime scene was taken 2 weeks before the victim's body was found. While examining the photos, investigators made a startling discovery. At first, it was blurry and indistinct, but an enlargement brought it into focus. There, in the pit, lay the body of Lisa Garland. Here was photographic proof that the victim was dead before Fleming was hospitalized. That meant she must have been in his car before his accident. The fiber had placed Garland in Fleming's car. The photograph established the time of death. All indications pointed to Fleming as the killer. Detectives Thorne and Cameron felt they now had all the evidence they needed to win a conviction. Then came the clincher. The analysis of the DNA from the crime scene came back from the lab.
The DNA test was done at the FBI lab, and the results were that Fleming was definitely a match.
At the trial, the events of that night were reconstructed by the prosecution, based on police speculation. Lisa Garland did make it home just after 1 o'clock in the morning on October 27th. David Fleming had followed her from the store. As she walked into her apartment, she forgot to lock the door behind her, a simple mistake that would prove fatal. David Fleming saw his opportunity. He then went into her apartment. It's not clear where he committed the crime, but fiber evidence proved that Garland's body was in Fleming's Delta 88 before he dumped it by the sand pit in the town of Alton. Fleming then returned home, where his girlfriend remembered him walking in around 3 o'clock in the morning. She recalled him not sleeping soundly and leaving around 5 a.m. About an hour later, Fleming got into an accident with an 18-wheeler. He was out of commission for 2 weeks, but the evidence showed he had already committed his crime. The fiber evidence linked the victim to his car. The photograph established an approximate time of her death. And the car accident closed his window of opportunity to just a sliver. On March 22, 1995, David Fleming was convicted of raping and murdering Lisa Garland. He is serving a life sentence on top of the 80 years for the rape in York. In case after case, fiber evidence has linked victims to their killers. But in a case in Florida, investigators relied on fibers to reconstruct the circumstances of a fatal car accident.
Was the emergency? Yes, some man just knocked on my door. He says he's had an accident and he thinks his friend's dead.
On a road in Tallahassee, Florida in 1994, a mild October evening turned terribly tragic. Strewn among broken beer bottles, snapped tree limbs, and mangled car parts lay the lifeless body of 30-year-old Michael Manella. A second victim, named Curtis Davison, was able to summon help before returning to the scene and collapsing. As paramedics treated Davison, Tallahassee police sized up the scene of the fatal accident. For crash investigators, time is even more critical than at a homicide investigation. At a homicide, officers can cordon off the crime scene and return to it later. Not so with a car wreck. Officers get just one chance to collect evidence. Traffic must return to normal as soon as possible. Crash investigators often rely on eyewitness accounts as a first source of information. But no one had seen this late-night crash. No one other than survivor Curtis Davison, and he was in no condition to make a statement. Crash homicide investigator Mike Walker had to rely on preliminary judgments based on the evidence he saw at the accident scene.
And what really struck me immediately was the passenger side of the vehicle was totally destroyed. The passenger door was nearly torn off the vehicle. We had an intact driver's side of the vehicle.
To Walker, that meant the passenger of the car would have sustained the most severe injuries. It was doubtful he could have survived, let alone walk away from the crash. But Davison told police he was the passenger. By some fluke, that may have been true. But could it be possible that Davison was lying to avoid being prosecuted for his friend's death? It was Walker's job to find out the truth. Investigators questioned anyone who might have seen the men before the crash. Witnesses told police that the two met at a local bar after work, where they had several drinks. They were then seen in another bar later that evening. Around 1 a.m., they left the bar and drove off together. But no one saw them get into the car. Without any witness, the detectives would have to rely on forensics to tell them who was driving. They first had to determine all they could about the crash and what factors were involved, like how fast the car was traveling. Returning to the crime scene the next morning, Walker and his partner, David Folsom, found the clues they needed.
The 300ZX suspect vehicle was traveling northbound on this road. As it rounded the curve, he began to lose control.
The driver turned the wheel to follow the curve, but the car's inertia kept it moving forward. As it left the road, it began to spin. Then it hit a tree.
The vehicle continued sliding sideways, striking another tree. As it struck the other tree, it went airborne approximately 40 feet, landing back in the road.
When a fast-moving vehicle changes direction, the tires slide sideways, leaving scuff marks on the road. By measuring these marks, called critical speed scuffs, and factoring in the friction of the road surface, investigators can calculate how fast the car was moving as it sped out of control.
The measurements from the critical speed scuff indicated that the vehicle was traveling at 89 to 96 miles per hour.
Almost from the start of the investigation, police had a hunch alcohol played a role. Broken beer bottles were found at the scene, and paramedics and officers detected alcohol on Davison's breath and on Manella's body. If Davison was the driver, and was under the influence at the time, investigators needed to test his blood alcohol level, and quickly. A blood sample was taken within 2 hours of the crash.
So what time did you start?
It's very important that once we establish that there's suspicion that he is the driver of a vehicle, then we have to obtain a blood sample because alcohol dissipates from the system.
Walker and Folsom ordered the blood work that morning. The sample was taken to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement Crime Lab to determine its alcohol level. First, the analyst takes a carefully measured portion of the blood she wants to test and places it into a clean, labeled vial. The alcohol in the blood is volatile. As the blood is shaken, it evaporates into the air or headspace of the vial. It's the components of the blood in the headspace and not the blood itself that's tested. The gas in the headspace is drawn into a chromatograph, which identifies its components and their concentration. The computer looks specifically for alcohol in the blood gases. In 10 minutes, it provides a reading. The results showed Davison's blood alcohol level at 0.04. Safely below Florida's legal limit. But that was the level when his blood was drawn at the hospital, not the level he had at the time of the accident. Because alcohol dissipates from the bloodstream at a consistent rate, the analyst can calculate what the level was 2 hours earlier when the accident occurred. Davison's level at the time of the crash was estimated to be between 0.06 and 0.08. In Florida, a level as low as 0.051 can be considered driving under the influence. But investigators still had to prove that he was behind the wheel. Back at his office, Walker pored over the accident scene photos and compared them to his notes. Parts of Davison's story weren't adding up. First was the car's restraining system. Walker recalled the driver's side airbag had been deployed. Airbags, by design, pin the driver in place. If Manella were driving, it seemed unlikely he'd have been thrown from the vehicle. Yet his body was found some 50 feet from where the car came to rest. On the other hand, the passenger's side seatbelt looked like it hadn't even been used. Whoever sat here could have been thrown. One more clue aroused suspicion. A bloody handprint on the outside of the driver's side door. It was too smudged to read, but it seemed likely it was made when the driver exited the car after the accident. But according to Folsom, the evidence could be misleading.
Now, traditionally, we cannot say that just because there's a bloody handprint that someone driving that car put it there because there's such thing as scene contamination. One of the rescue personnel or one of the police officers could have done it. But it was enough to spur suspicion as to who was actually the driver, the deceased or the survivor.
By themselves, the evidence of a bloody handprint, minor injuries, and an unused seatbelt meant very little. Taken together, they created serious doubt about Davison's story. Davison, however, was sticking to it, insisting that he was the passenger. The definitive version of the tale would be told in the lab. Investigators faced no shortage of clues about the car crash that claimed a man's life. The trick was to make sense of them. Crash investigator Mike Walker had the wreck towed to a secure impound facility for analysis. Ward Schwob is an analyst at the Department of Law Enforcement lab.
One of the parts of my job as a crime scene analyst is to go and examine a vehicle without any outside influences. A lot of the times I'll go and look at the vehicle itself and try not to learn any of the particulars about the case. I'll take an objective view of the vehicle, see what I can determine, see what the evidence tells me.
To piece together the particulars, he began with the driver's side seatbelt, fastening it in a position as if someone were wearing it. He noticed spots on the seatbelt near the door. They tested positive for human blood. That indicated the seatbelt was probably worn at the time of the crash. It also meant that whoever wore it was probably not ejected from the car. Signs again pointed to Davison. The evidence was suggestive, but slippery. Even if the blood proved to be Davison's, the defense could argue that it could have spattered onto the belt while the car was spinning, or that Davison could have bled on it after the crash as he staggered around the car. To seal this case, investigators needed to find evidence that fit 3 criteria. First, the evidence could be left only at the moment of impact. Second, it had to be unique to the individual who left it. And third, it had to prove where that person was sitting in the car. Investigators depended on fibers to meet those criteria, and they depended on Regional Crime Lab microanalyst Paula Sauer to read them. Detectives Walker and Folsom gave Sauer several pieces of material evidence collected from the accident scene, including a dashboard with 2 dents in it and clothing worn by the victims. The dents in the dash were on the passenger's side. It was presumed they were caused by contact with the passenger's knees. Remarkably, the force of the crash created so much frictional heat that woven patterns and fibers were actually melted into the vinyl.
There were fibers, numerous fibers embedded in the dashboard area that would be directly in front of the passenger seat. These fibers were microscopically consistent with the fibers composing Manella's pants.
The evidence seemed to indicate that Manella was in the passenger's seat. But Sauer wouldn't stop there. She scrutinized every piece of evidence to be certain her results were consistent. She turned her attention to strands of human hair and synthetic fibers gathered from the cracks of the passenger side of the windshield. Michael Manella wore a hairpiece composed of both human hair and synthetic fibers. If the fibers from his hairpiece matched those in the windshield, it would strengthen the argument that he was the passenger and that Davison, the survivor of the crash, was driving. An inspection of the synthetic hairs using a high-power comparison microscope suggested the fibers in the windshield matched those in Manella's hairpiece. But analyzing these fibers required more than a visual inspection because of the small size of their molecules. To complete her comparison, Sauer used an instrument called a Fourier Transform Infrared Spectrometer, or FTIR.
It is an instrument that is used to determine the generic class of synthetic fibers. By generic class, I mean whether it's nylon, polyester, acrylic, and this technique is very effective in that manner because it's actually looking at the molecules that are making up those fibers, so it can give you an exact identification.
The characteristics of both fibers were displayed on a computer. The red lines represent fibers from the hairpiece. The green lines represent fibers pulled from the windshield. In every way, they were identical. So far, all indications were that Manella was in the passenger seat. If that were true, it meant Davison would have left his mark in the area of the driver's seat, most likely on the airbag, which would have deployed at over 100 miles per hour. Sauer analyzed fibers clinging to the tightly woven fabric of the airbag. She found 9 fibers matching the fabric of Davison's pants. Her her conclusion, Davison was driving. Paula Sauer used her sophisticated optics to put the accident scene into focus. Not only had she placed Manella in the passenger seat, but also determined that Davison was the driver. The evidence was handed over to the state's attorney, who showed in court that Davison lied about the events that unfolded in the early morning hours of October 6, 1994. The prosecution's theory was that after a night of drinking, it was Curtis Davison who got behind the wheel of Manella's Nissan 300ZX. Anxious to test the sports car's power, Davison put it in high gear, racing down the tree-lined two-lane road. Ignoring the 35-mile-per-hour signs, Davison climbed toward 90. Then the narrow road started to curve, and Davison lost control. No longer heeding the steering wheel, the car slid sideways and careened off an oak tree. Michael Manella, in the passenger seat, was thrown from the vehicle. He wasn't wearing a seatbelt. The sports car continued to spin out of control, smashing into another tree before coming to rest on the side of the road. Davison, saved by the airbag, crawled out of the car. He went around to the passenger side to look for Manella, his bloody left hand leaving a smear on the door. Manella was dead in the road. Davison went for help. A Tallahassee jury took just 10 minutes to find Davison guilty of manslaughter by culpable negligence. He was sentenced to 7 years. The analysis of tiny fibers, traces of evidence found in ordinary items, turned the tables on 3 men who denied any involvement in their respective crimes. The ability of forensic scientists to pinpoint the makeup of fiber down to the most microscopic detail allows prosecutors to tear alibis into shreds of evidence. Investigators race to stop a serial bomber who sends his deadly parcels by mail. 3 people have been killed, and no one knows how many more packages are en route to their targets. In California, experts match wits with a terrorist bent on crippling the Internal Revenue Service. For 5 years, his bombs have confounded authorities. Sheer luck has prevented injuries, but sheer skill is what's needed to catch him. Beneath the rubble, the terrorist leaves a calling card that experts are learning to read. In bomb investigations, forensics means the difference between feeling safe and living in terror. Fear is the terrorist's greatest ally. To achieve his ends, he doesn't care who dies. He can strike anywhere, anytime. And though his crimes are carefully plotted, their effect seems horribly random. When bombs are his weapon of choice, he can kill from a distance. In Birmingham, Alabama, 2 weeks before Christmas 1989, Helen Vance accepted a package addressed to her husband, Robert. Federal Judge Robert Vance came in from his yard work to find the package on the table where his wife was wrapping gifts. Believing it contained magazines he'd been waiting for, he cut the string and opened the box. was killed instantly. When paramedics arrived on the scene, they tried to help Helen Vance, who was standing nearby when the bomb exploded. She was temporarily deafened from the blast and in shock, unable to speak. Forensic experts rushed to the scene to investigate. They collected nails embedded in the walls and ceiling, shards of steel pipe, and the remnants of the package itself. The explosion had hurled the shrapnel up to 3,600 miles per hour. Each fragment was carefully cataloged. Only the most meticulous work would allow authorities to catch a killer who struck from a distance. And that killer wasn't stopping. 150 miles away in Atlanta, 2 days after Judge Vance was killed, a package arrived at the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals, addressed to the clerk's office. A routine X-ray revealed the ominous silhouette of a pipe bomb. Before the shocked security officers could stop it, the package dropped to the floor. The officers immediately evacuated the building and called bomb technicians. An alert posted after the death of Judge Vance described the device that killed him. The Atlanta bomb resembled the one in Birmingham. Though Vance's bomb was rigged to explode when the package was opened, the bomb techs had to assume this one could blow at any moment. The drop from the conveyor belt and routine handling in the post office could have rendered it unstable. Their Kevlar suits, 3 inches thick and weighing 80 pounds, provide safety only at a distance. If the tech is close to the detonation, the pressure from the blast would crush him. The first step was to photograph and X-ray the bomb to study its components. The X-rays revealed no timing device, so the techs breathed a little easier.
I think the switch is going to be all right. We know the bomb.
There was no reason to rush. Unless a bomb is rigged to a timer or strapped to a victim, bomb removal typically takes hours. Every step was planned, every motion rehearsed. As each maneuver was carefully completed, the bomb techs paused to ventilate their smothering suits and modify their strategy. As a precaution, the area around the building was kept clear of pedestrians and traffic. Throughout the delicate operation, their hands remained uncovered to assure they kept a secure grip. Once they were certain the bomb was stable, they lowered it into a bin and put it in an armored trailer. Police cars and motorcycles cleared a safe area around the vehicle. The convoy took the least populated route to the bomb range at the city landfill. The package was rendered safe, but this second bomb in 2 days had enormous impact. It suggested a serial bomber. Alcohol, tobacco, and firearms Special Agent Brian Hoback was assigned to the case.
You got to remember who the targets were. 1, a judge, a federal judge. 2, people at the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals who had nothing to do with the judicial system other than administrative matters.
But the bomber wasn't through. On December 18th, the same day the Atlanta bomb was deactivated, attorney Robbie Robinson received a package in Savannah, 250 miles away. Like Judge Vance, Robinson had no reason to suspect anything sinister about the package sitting on his desk a week before Christmas. In an instant, he became the killer's second victim. Investigators mapped out the direction of the explosion to better estimate the size of the bomb. They set up a grid and began the tedious task of collecting even the tiniest shreds of evidence.
When investigators go to a crime scene, they're looking for physical evidence. That evidence in a bombing scene is everywhere. It's on the ceilings, it's on the ground, it's in the walls, it's in the furniture, it's in the victim's body, it's on the victim's clothing. First, we photograph. Then we grid the room so that we know exactly where that piece of evidence came from and we can articulate that to a jury. We got down on our hands and knees and collected that evidence, sifted it, stick it over a screen, shake the debris to see if we can't find components of whatever the device was that exploded. In that particular case, it was a pipe bomb inside of a cardboard box.
One of the more insidious aspects of the bomb was the fact that dozens of nails, seen here in X-rays of the victim's body, were packed around the pipe, increasing the deadliness of the explosion. These nails matched those from Judge Vance's bomb and the package intercepted at the courthouse in Atlanta. The wrapping, found almost intact in Robinson's trash can, was also comparable to the other bombs. With 3 bombs in 2 days, time was precious. Agent Hoback and his multi-agency team struggled to find a link between the 3 targets. Why would someone single out this particular lawyer, judge, and court building? The bombing seemed like random strikes against the legal system. If that were true, the bomber would be hard to predict and harder to catch. They couldn't anticipate who the next victim might be, and it was likely that the bomb was already in the mail.
His shot is peeled backwards on that.
In the lab, experts studied the nails, pieces of pipe, bits of wire, and package remnants collected from the exploded bombs. They took inventory of the most minute details. Barely perceptible markings, fragments of logos, tiny pieces of packaging, all may lead to manufacturers or retail outlets or directly to a killer. But in this case, the items surviving the blast were too generic to tell them anything. The bomber continued with his deadly plan. Fortunately, Jacksonville, Florida NAACP President Willie Dennis was too busy to open her mail on December 18th. Learning of Robinson's death in Savannah and warned by her friends to be wary of any packages, she called her secretary the next day to advise him not to open the parcel on her desk.
What she later did was call the sheriff's department down there in Jacksonville and requested them to look at a package that to her seemed somewhat suspicious.
The technicians noted it was identical to packages used in the previous bombings. They photographed and X-rayed it to see if their suspicions were justified.
You got a power supply, you got wires going into an unknown dense substance.
The X-rays disclosed a device that matched the other bombs, so investigators had the advantage of knowing what they were dealing with.
First thing we want to do is
The technicians used a mechanical device to disable its firing system. The package had been successfully ripped apart. Still wary of an explosion, technicians carefully pulled the unexploded pipe bomb from the office while maintaining a cautious distance. It was brought to a bomb range, studied, rendered safe, and carefully dismantled. Left behind in the office were the now familiar nails and brown paper with red and white mailing labels. Like most mail bombers, this one affixed more than enough postage to assure his package was delivered. This parcel also contained something surprising, a roll of hate mail. It included a copy of a threatening letter sent to a Jacksonville television station. The postmark linked it to an Atlanta post office. So now the agents knew the bomb was probably sent from Georgia. The physical evidence was building. These strongly worded letters put right-wing fringe groups high on the list of suspects. The ATF assembled a task force to outsmart the bomber. Terry Pelfrey, a bomb technician with the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, was called into the group's monthly lunch meeting.
My role in the investigation was to first look at right-wing groups that were located in Georgia. These included the Ku Klux Klan, the Aryan Nation members, Christian Identity Church Movement members, and skinheads. We had informants in each of these groups. Some of the informants ranked as high as Grand Dragons in these groups, which were the leaders of the Ku Klux Klan. There was no talk within the right-wing movement groups that would give us any indication of bomb suspects in these groups.
At the December 19th meeting, an ATF agent outlined the similarities among the recent bombing incidents.
After considerable effort, did you see anything you recognize?
He passed around pictures of the bomb recovered at the courthouse and described what he knew of its construction.
The device consists of a pipe bomb with flat welded end plates.
The description struck a spark of recognition for ATF bomb expert Lloyd Irwin. The bombs resembled one he saw in 1972. Though he had inspected more than 3,000 bombs in his career, he had a feeling this was the work of the same bomber.
The minute I looked at it, I saw some characteristics of this bomb that reminded me of the 1972 bomb. That being that it had square end plates held with a bolt through the center. I only had one bolt, but still it was the same technique.
How about drawing me a picture?
He hadn't seen another like it in more than 15 years. From memory, Irwin sketched the 1972 bomb.
You learn that the guy, even though he changes his technique, if he's made them before, he'll keep something similar because he knows it worked before. Why trash it when he can make it work again? So he might modify it, but he'll still have some similarities of something that he's done before.
Did we get him?
Yeah.
For Irwin, the construction of the devices bore the signature of the 1972 bomber. Right after the meeting, he called Special Agent Hoback.
So Lloyd Irwin called me back at the office to advise me that he had seen only one other device like this in all the years that he had been involved in these types of investigations, and he gave me the name of the man who had been convicted of possessing that device in 1972. That man's name was Walter Leroy Moody.
Roy Moody had been convicted of building a bomb he intended to send to the man who had repossessed his car. The bomb's real victim, however, was Moody's wife, Hazel, who inadvertently opened the package, injuring her hand and eye and severely burning her face. Roy Moody went to prison, and Hazel was granted a divorce. The ATF began taking a closer look at Roy Moody.
We eliminate suspects by different things. Motive might be one way to eliminate them, whether their presence was actually in the area. There's a number of ways to eliminate suspects. However, what we were doing with other suspects by eliminating them, we could not do with Walter Leroy Moody.
At this point, most of the evidence linking Moody to the bombings was circumstantial. The investigators now had to positively link the components of the bombs to the suspected bomber. For that, they relied on the ATF Forensics Lab in Atlanta. By analyzing the chemical composition of the detonators and primers, experts determined who manufactured them. Fortunately, the company had very limited distribution in the Southeast. The manufacturer provided a list of the stores that sold their product. Meanwhile, the ATF noted further similarities between Moody's 1972 bomb and the recent ones. All used cardboard boxes, metal pipes with square end caps and a rod, flashlight batteries, and flashlight bulbs. So investigators would have more first-hand information. Specialists recreated and detonated the bombs. When powder packed inside a sealed pipe is ignited, it quickly converts from solid to gas. The resulting pressure is enormous. In an instant, the pipe bursts, sending razor-sharp fragments of steel and nails in all directions at deadly speed. Whoever built these bombs went to great lengths to maximize their destructive power. They were made for only one purpose: to kill. A behavioral profile described the killer as a white male, working and living alone or with one other person, disciplined, educated, self-structured, meticulous, and cowardly. He believed his current job was beneath him. Presented with that profile, Terry Pelfrey recognized the precise description of the man he had been investigating, Roy Moody.
Bill Hagmeyer with the FBI did the psychological profiling. He did not know Walter Leroy Moody at all. And so I sat during the meetings with Mr. Hagmeyer. He read the psychological profile that he had written up, and he wrote Mr. Moody's life story in that profile. It was really rather scary.
The weight of the combined evidence was enough to obtain a search warrant. On February 8th, investigators searched Moody's house. They uncovered law books and transcripts of Moody's 1972 bomb trial.
As we found in his transcripts during this search warrant, the highlighted areas where we matched forensically the evidence from the explosive site to the evidence that was found within his home and his workshop. All that matched in 1972, so in 1989, Mr. Moody gets smarter. He thinks he gets smarter.
But it was the clues detectives failed to find that raised their suspicions further.
We knew that Mr. Moody kept his books from school because he had his law books. However, he didn't have his chemistry books. We also did not find the weapons that apparently Mr. Moody owned. We knew he owned some because he had ammunition in the front seat of his pickup truck. So where were those weapons?
Following a lead, investigators secured permission to search the basement of a house in Chamblee, Georgia, where Moody rented storage space. They found a pipe with caps screwed onto each end. The caps had holes drilled through them, and one of the ends had a nut welded atop it, ready for a rod to be threaded through. One of the investigators on the scene was ATF Special Agent David Heitch.
All ATF agents are trained in our basic school to identify improvised explosive devices, and the most basic and most commonly used improvised explosive device in this country is a pipe bomb. And so when you see a pipe nipple with end caps affixed, I automatically think that potentially we've got a pipe bomb.
Heitch took the pipe to chemist Lloyd Irwin, who suspected Roy Moody's handiwork early in the investigation. Irwin scraped the pipe in search of explosive residue. His analysis yielded only rust. The pipe may have been a prototype, but agents had no way to prove it. They just didn't have enough to make their case. In their search for more evidence in the mail bombings, investigators went to stores that sold the brand of primers used in the bombs. Their hunt led them to the Shootin' Iron gun shop in Griffin, Georgia. An employee remembered selling a 4-pound keg of Red Dot smokeless powder and 4,000 handgun primers in December of 1989. The large purchase stuck in his mind. Red Dot was the powder used in the December bombs, and 3,200 primers were needed to fire them. In a photo lineup, the clerk chose Roy Moody as the customer. Investigators felt they had their man. On July 10, 1990, Roy Moody was arrested and held without bail. Police also brought into custody his wife, Susan, as a possible accomplice. She was permitted a bond. Susan Moody was allowed to plead guilty to a lesser charge of conspiracy in exchange for her complete cooperation. She told investigators how she had been a servant to Roy almost since the day they met in 1981. She said Roy taught her to cover her trail, use disguises, buy materials, and mail packages far from home. She also offered the name of Roy's former cellmate. When investigators searched his house, they found footlockers with Moody's name on them. They contained the missing guns and chemistry books. Agents also found ammunition, a bomb diagram, and an arc welding unit. Susan Moody's testimony was crucial to cracking the case.
She pretty much put everything together for us. We had bits and pieces all throughout the investigation of why Moody did this, how he did this, to what extent he did the bombings the same way that he did in 1972 as far as their construction. However, Mrs. Moody actually told us how he went about the process and how the process began with the motive.
And what was that motive? Roy Moody had a history of frivolous litigation. Most of his cases were thrown out of court. He was desperate to become a lawyer so he could fix what he considered to be a flawed system. But he was denied the bar exam because of his 1972 felony conviction for creating the bomb that injured his first wife. When he failed to have the conviction overturned, Moody swore revenge against the judicial system. He started with Judge Robert Vance, who had written an opinion denying his appeal. Moody was caught through dedicated investigative work, detailed forensics, and the sharp memory of bomb investigator Lloyd Irwin.
We have a computer system at ATF that matches up bomb components, and it's a very valuable computer system, and we're continuously refining that computer system. It's amazing what it can do. You can enter the components you have from a device, and it will tell you if there have ever been any similar devices constructed. Well, in this particular case, Lloyd beat the computer, and there's no substitute for experience like Lloyd has.
The legal system that Roy Moody felt had failed him did not fail the citizens he terrorized. In June 1991, the jury sentenced him to 7 life terms plus 400 years, later changed to the death penalty. Moody's twisted agenda relied on the U.S. mail to deliver his bombs to specific people. But other terrorists are not so particular about who they murder. The Oklahoma City bombing was thought to be a strike against government. In the process of destroying the building, 168 citizens were killed. When a terrorist targets the government, there's no predicting how or when he'll attack. In the early morning hours of February 22, 1990, the West Los Angeles Fire Department answered a routine call to douse a burning truck around the corner from their station. But this was no standard vehicle fire. The truck, parked in front of an office building, contained 5 55-gallon barrels and clusters of pipes in its bed, all tilted toward the building. The pipes were improvised mortars designed to lob pipe bombs. Some had already launched. To keep the barrels from rupturing, firefighters used gentle pressure to cool them and extinguish the fire. Bomb technicians were called in. Members of the Los Angeles Police Department bomb squad rushed to the scene. As they suited up, firefighters explained what they had found. Bomb squad detective Joe Powell realized that a huge catastrophe was narrowly averted.
The fire department described that the drums were cherry red hot because of the fire, and they put the fire out with the water hose that they normally use. The fire department was extremely lucky that the device did not detonate on them when they were putting the fire out.
Powell's primary concern was to be sure there were no secondary devices, so he checked the 5th floor where windows had been broken by the homemade mortar rounds. The bombs penetrated the office of the IRS, which occupied the 5th floor, but damage was minimal. Then he and his partner cautiously approached the truck. They needed to determine whether the truck was booby-trapped, since their first priority is to keep people from getting hurt.
Once the area was evacuated, we went up and took individual samples out of each drum, analyzed them at the scene visually, and then sent them back to the lab for a scientific evaluation to see what the chemical structure was.
The contents of the barrels were sent to the lab. Using a gas chromatograph, the samples were broken down into their chemical components. The tests determined that the substance inside the barrels was ANFO, an unstable mixture of ammonium nitrate and fuel oil. The truck contained more than 200 gallons of ANFO. To understand the destructive potential of that much explosive, the LAPD performed a test explosion in the California desert. They filled a pickup truck with a combination of ANFO and TNT to simulate the conditions at the IRS building. the truck had been obliterated. Wreckage littered the desert floor. Nothing recognizable was left behind. In an urban setting, the damage from such an explosion would have been colossal, says FBI Special Agent Nick Boone.
That is almost the equivalent of 1,600 pounds of TNT. This is a high explosive. The blast would have gone out in all directions and done extreme damage for many blocks. The only thing that would have made it more devastating is had this same truck been confined as if in the parking garage, the effect would have been something like Oklahoma City.
In fact, the parking garage was the scene of a potential bombing less than 2 years earlier. In that case, too, disaster was narrowly averted. The IRS building had been the target of bombings before. In September 1988, the basement parking garage was the scene of the first incident. Detective Powell and the bomb squad disarmed a 1971 Toyota at this address. It contained a water heater filled with ANFO. It also had a booby trap under the rear tire. When tripped, the car burst into flames. As the fire department extinguished it, they found pipe bombs in the trunk. Bomb squad technicians determined that gasoline cans and plastic detergent bottles in the back seat were filled with ammonia and bleach. They were designed to fill the garage with poisonous fumes. The bombs were deactivated without incident. The car had been reported stolen from the parking lot of Ford Aerospace, but there the trail grew cold. But not for long. 6 months later, a routine line check by the power company uncovered pipe bombs attached to 4 high-voltage power poles behind the same building. The bombs detonated, causing minor damage. The IRS building in West LA wasn't the bombers' only target. The power line bombs resembled one found 8 months earlier, about 50 miles away. An electronic detonator and ANFO were attached to the base of a power pole servicing the IRS building in Laguna Niguel, California. It was rendered harmless by the bomb squad. It was clear the bombings were related. These attacks and bombings in other buildings dating back to 1986 led to the formation of a multi-agency task force on terrorism. It found that the circuitry in all the bombs was similar. FBI Special Agent Frank Bakhti was a case agent for the task force.
All explosive devices, especially serial bomber explosive devices, have a specific signature or type of construction unique to the bomb maker. And if you could examine a series of unexplained bombings, you can examine the way the bombs are put together and make a fairly educated guess as to whether one person might be responsible based upon the way the bombs are constructed.
Besides the design similarities, all the bombings shared a common target, the Internal Revenue Service.
We began investigating in several directions. One was to try and find other similar bombings that were committed in this area and to see who was either convicted of those bombings or suspected. We also went in the direction of states' rights, anti-government, anti-IRS groups, because they would logically be the kind of people that might attack the buildings and go after IRS.
A potential lead arrived in the mail. In letters sent to the newspaper and to the IRS building, a group calling itself Up the IRS Incorporated claimed responsibility for the truck bombing, as it had the 1988 car bomb attack. Boone considered the letter authentic, as it contained information about the bomb not made public. The envelopes were addressed by hand, giving investigators a writing sample, but they had nothing to compare it against. A more immediately helpful clue was a digital watch used as a timing device. Investigators believed the bomber was trying to show off his high-tech skills. But to no avail. The alarm on the watch used to ignite the truck bomb wasn't set properly, so the device didn't detonate as planned. Even so, the circuitry of the bombs provided the first clear lead. Many components were built exclusively for the military and were unavailable on the street. That suggested the bomber had some contact with the high-tech industry. The fact that the car used in the garage bombing in 1988 was stolen from the parking lot at Ford Aerospace gave LAPD Detective Bob Nelson an avenue to pursue.
We learned later on in the investigation as we went through the components that there were certain identifiable wires and electronic components that were directly attributed to the Ford Aerospace location. However, there was no estimate as to when they were actually utilized. There was no date or any way to tell if it was an old surplus item or something current.
Nelson and Boone were certain the bomber was a past or present employee of Ford Aerospace. But the company employs thousands. The detectives had no way of narrowing the pool. Thanks to the swift action of the West Los Angeles Fire Department, one of the most pivotal clues was preserved. The serial number from the truck used in the 1990 bombing was traced to its last registered owners. Mr. and Mrs. Orozco had sold it for $500 in December of 1989.
Okay, does it run?
According to Mr. Orozco, the buyer hardly spoke, asked few questions, and seemed anxious to leave. He didn't haggle over the price, and he paid cash. The name he signed on the title form was James T. Harmon. Police knew that if they found Harmon, they'd find the bomber. But what did he look like? A police artist brought an identikit to the Orozcos to create a composite sketch.
Oh, yeah. It was...
there was some balding going on.
It contains hundreds of overlays of generic facial features.
The style, straight.
By mixing and matching, the artist slowly fashioned a likeness of the suspect that the witnesses were satisfied with. An initial check with FBI, ATF, and LAPD files came up empty. In the meantime, the bomber struck again. On the morning of March 31st, 1991, mortar fire buffeted the parking lot and roof of the IRS Service Center in Fresno, California. No one was hurt. The 13 missiles were launched from a vacant lot, where investigators collected extension cords, wiring, and crumpled newspaper used as packing. They also picked up a digital watch timing device and aerospace circuitry. Agent Boone knew the same bomber was responsible, and he knew he and Detective Nelson were getting closer to catching him.
I took one look at it, saw many of our components, and knew this is our bomber again. This is our serial bomber. But this time he slipped up, and we got the major break of the case. One of those components was what we call a heat sink. It's simply a piece of metal that disperses heat.
Boone believed the specialized component was probably made by Ford Aerospace. He needed to learn more about it, but everyone at the plant was a potential suspect. Who could he trust? Discreet inquiries about the component brought him nothing. Frustrated, getting nowhere, he showed it to the assembly engineer, taking the chance he wasn't the bomber.
He walked down one corridor, turned the corner, walked down another, reached into a bin, and handed me an identical heat sink. I can't tell you what the feeling was like at that point. It was the most exciting part of the case ever. And I also began to look around quite concerned that I'm now standing here with the heat sink in my hand, and there's every possibility that the bomber is 2 tables away, is on the assembly line, is the engineer around the corner. We got out of there about as fast as we could get away from the assembly line and back off the floor.
Although identifying numbers had been filed off, the components were ringed with red paint. The engineer explained that meant they were defective and pulled off the line. This considerably narrowed down the possible areas at Ford Aerospace.
Only 84 of them were ever manufactured, and 9 of them only had been pulled off the line as defective. So now we really had 4 of 9 in the entire world.
Hello, sir. Thanks for seeing us.
Investigators brought the composite sketch to the manager of the engineering lab, the most likely source of the heat sink. The manager didn't recognize the face and didn't know a James Harmon. Who was this man? Detectives knew they were getting close, but the identity of their bomber still eluded them. How soon before he struck again? How soon before he killed someone? As their search for the bomber continued, Agent Boone and Detective Nelson received a call from the lab manager. After thinking about it, he did in fact recognize the face in the police sketch. It bore a resemblance to an engineer in the large-scale inspection lab. It looked like a man named Dean Harvey Hicks. The investigators raced back to Ford Aerospace. At his desk, they found anti-IRS cartoons, and in his employee file were writing samples that matched the handwriting on the envelopes of the letters that claimed responsibility.
Once we reached a part of the investigation where we were at Ford Aerospace, and Nick Boone pulled open the personnel file and made the comparison with the photograph and the handprinting and handwriting, we knew that Dean Harvey Hicks was our suspect.
Digging deeper, agents learned that on January 17, 1990, a man named James T. Harmon purchased 700 pounds of ammonium nitrate fertilizer, the main ingredient of ANFO, at the Orange County Farm Supply Company. James T. Harmon was the name on the DMV form submitted after the purchase of the truck used in the 1990 bombing. The handwriting on the receipt matched that of Dean Harvey Hicks. Incriminating handwriting was also found at the scene of the Fresno bombing, placing Hicks at the scene.
He had figured on some newspaper how far his mortar bombs would fire, how much powder would send the bomb how far, and he had worked this out on this piece of newspaper. He then wadded that up and actually used it for packing in the Fresno device. We had that also. When we straightened that out and were able to look at the numbers on a flat surface, we were able to actually also match those to his handwriting.
Agent Boone and Detective Nelson tallied the evidence. Hicks had been off work when each of the bombs was planted. He had access to all of the items linked to Ford Aerospace. He matched the description of the purchaser of the truck used in 1990, and his handwriting matched the letters claiming responsibility. But detectives didn't know if he was acting alone. Before they arrested him, they kept an eye on him.
Surveillance continued while the arrest warrant and search warrants were being prepared, while we looked into his past to determine whether or not there was other people involved with him. At a point in the investigation, we believed that there may be some interest in him constructing another device. We initiated the search warrant and the arrest warrant the following day.
His arrest came on July 11, 1991. Hicks was brought to a hotel room for interview. There, he seemed pleased to provide details about the bombings. He especially liked to answer technical questions the investigators could not figure out.
By the time we had finished the interview, Dean Hicks had made a complete confession and described to us in great detail how he put together and delivered most of the bombs. He actually had some loss of recollection on some of them because it was just too long ago, but he was incredibly detailed on all of the more recent bombings, how he meticulously put them together and how he constructed them and how he delivered them to the site.
While Boone and Nelson interviewed Hicks, forensics experts searched his house and garage. There, they found bombs in progress, circuits, ammonium nitrate, and false ID bearing the name of James T. Harmon. The story became very clear. His co-workers at Ford Aerospace knew that Dean Harvey Hicks despised the IRS. But they didn't know he was stealing parts from the workplace in order to attack the government agency. In 1981, Hicks had claimed an $8,500 income tax deduction, a contribution to an organization that the IRS did not consider non-profit. It denied the deduction. Hicks claimed that the IRS employee he spoke with laughed at him, so he used his electronics expertise to exact his revenge. Though he claimed to be part of a group, the Task Force on Terrorism determined that Hicks acted alone.
Organized groups are not always responsible for acts of domestic terrorism. One person can do just as much damage with a little bit of explosive knowledge as an entire terrorist organization. And I think in the past, we would always tend to look at the organized terrorist organizations being responsible for some of the acts. I think Mr. Hicks has shown everyone that one person acting alone can be just as deadly and just as dangerous as a large group.
As clever as Dean Harvey Hicks was, the tireless efforts of investigators like Agent Nick Boone and Detective Bob Nelson finally ended his reign of terror. Finding him guilty on 4 counts of using destructive devices against a federal facility, a jury sentenced Hicks to 20 years in prison. Ironically, he was also ordered to pay more than $335,000 to the Internal Revenue Service. The crimes of Dean Hicks and Roy Moody were personal vendettas disguised as political statements. Like all acts of terrorism, the senseless deeds of these desperate men accomplished nothing. Despite its mystique, terrorism is a crime like any other. And like all crimes, the perpetrator can't help but leave clues behind. With each new case, forensic detectives refine their ability to trace those clues back to the criminal.
I'll just look over here, detective. Yeah.
A serial killer in Texas goes undetected for 11 years. Police identify a suspect, but their case must be pulled from the trash. Investigators hope new forensic techniques can establish a link among the murders and put an end to the violent rampage. In California, a missing persons case leads detectives to a secret burial ground at a Sacramento boarding house. An unlikely suspect becomes the focus of a mass murder investigation. Can science help unmask the murderer hiding behind a kindly face? Homicide investigators find that things aren't always what they appear to be. Seemingly insignificant clues may expose a pattern and put police on the trail of a killer whose compulsion is to kill again. On the morning of December 21st, 1984, in Wichita Falls, Texas, Lisa Boone returned home from her job at a local hospital and found herself locked out. Lisa asked her landlady to unlock the apartment. She'd given her keys to Terry Sims, a friend and co-worker who was spending the night.
Terry?
But Terry wasn't answering the door.
Terry? Terry?
Inside, the women found the apartment had been ransacked. Lisa called out to Terry, but got no response.
Terry! I didn't hear. Oh, Terry?
The landlady noticed blood on the floor and followed the trail. It led to Terry Sims' body. Officers from the Wichita Falls Police Department responded to the scene. Upstairs, they found the 20-year-old victim dead on the bathroom floor. She was nude, except for socks. Her hands had been tied behind her back. Police processed the scene, looking for any clue that might identify the killer. They collected blood samples, a pair of white tennis shoes with the laces still tied, and a woman's hospital uniform. They also recovered a blood-stained bedspread and sheets. At the police station, Lisa told detectives that she and Terry Sims left the hospital together after working the 3 to 11 shift. She explained that she was also a part-time student at Midwestern State University and had an exam the next day. Terry was going to stay the night at Lisa's apartment to help her study in the morning. But Lisa said the hospital was short-staffed that night, so she volunteered for an extra shift. She dropped her friend off at the apartment around 12:30, gave Terry her keys, and returned to work.
When was the last time you saw her?
Lisa told police she'd arrived back home around 7 a.m. and knocked on the door. She had no idea who could have murdered her friend. An autopsy was performed on Terry Sims, and cause of death was determined to be multiple stab wounds to the chest and back. While there was no sign of forcible rape, biological evidence was collected from the victim's body.
Excuse me, detective?
Most murder victims know their killers, so Wichita Falls police began interviewing Terry Sims' family and friends.
About Tony? You talking about my girlfriend?
They quickly focused on her ex-boyfriend. He denied involvement. Investigators had little evidence against him, but they had a new forensic tool in their arsenal. In 1984, DNA profiling was in its infancy and held the potential to link a killer to his crime through biological evidence left at the scene. But large amounts of evidence were needed to successfully perform the tests. Hoping samples recovered in Terry Sims' case might identify her murderer, police submitted them to the Gene Screen Lab in Dallas. But their hopes were soon dashed. There wasn't enough material for DNA testing. With no hard evidence linking a suspect to the murder, the investigation stalled, and the case remained unsolved. On February 15th, 1985, 2 months after Terry Sims was found murdered, an electric company employee was working on a transformer just outside the Wichita Falls city limits. He made a horrifying discovery. He stumbled upon a woman's body. He called 911. Deputies from the Archer County Sheriff's Department arrived at the scene. In the woods, they found the victim. Nearby, they recovered a leather jacket, a blood-stained nurse's uniform, and a pair of sneakers with the laces still tied. A search of police databases turned up a missing person fitting the victim's description. An autopsy confirmed her identity as Toni Gibbs, a 23-year-old nurse from Wichita Falls, reported missing by her brother a month earlier. The pathologist determined that she died from stab wounds to the chest and abdomen. Biological evidence was collected from the victim's body. Archer County investigators developed several suspects. They soon focused on a man named Danny Wayne Laughlin. He was the last person seen with Toni Gibbs. He had also been held on suspicion of rape in Kansas City, Missouri, less than a year before. Laughlin denied killing Toni Gibbs, but 3 separate polygraph tests suggested deception. At investigators' request, he provided blood and hair samples for DNA testing. Though the results were inconclusive, police believed they had the right man. Laughlin stood trial for the murder of Toni Gibbs. The jury was unable to reach a verdict. A mistrial was declared. Laughlin was never tried again. The Gibbs case remained open. On October 10, 1985, a maintenance worker was cutting grass alongside a road in Wichita County. In the overgrowth, he discovered a woman's body. He called the Wichita County Sheriff's Department. When deputies responded, they found the body of a woman, nude except for one sock. There were no clues as to the victim's identity. Police searched the surrounding area and found her clothing nearby. They also recovered a pair of sneakers with the laces tied. An autopsy was performed, but advanced decomposition made it difficult to determine how the woman died. Based on available evidence, however, the medical examiner concluded the cause of death to be undetermined homicidal violence. Wichita County Sheriff's deputies determined that the victim fit the description of a woman reported missing a month earlier. She was identified as 21-year-old Ellen Blau. They interviewed 2 suspects who had been with her the night she was last seen. But deputies had insufficient evidence to charge them. After several months, the case remained unsolved. While the 3 cases were investigated by different law enforcement agencies, they all fell under the jurisdiction of the Wichita County District Attorney's Office. Barry Maka had recently been elected district attorney and took over just days after Terry Sims' murder. The unsolved murders haunted him.
The absolute terror that they went through in the final minutes of their lives motivated me to find the person responsible for their deaths.
But investigators in each of the cases had exhausted all their leads, and there was nothing more Maka could do. More than a decade would pass before there was a break in the unsolved murders. By 1996, more than 11 years had passed since the murders of Terry Sims, Toni Gibbs, and Ellen Blau in Texas. Police still had no viable suspects in any of the murders. But improved forensic procedures prompted the Wichita County District Attorney to request a re-examination of the evidence from 2 of the 3 murders. Some of the evidence was sent to Glenn Unash, a latent print examiner at the Texas Department of Public Safety Crime Lab in Austin. He found a partial print on a sneaker recovered from the Terry Sims murder scene that had gone undetected. It didn't belong to Terry Sims. However, there was insufficient detail to make a comprehensive analysis. Because blood will darken as it absorbs the light, Unash hoped more ridge characteristics would emerge under laser light. He was disappointed. There was one more option, a dye staining technique. But there was a risk involved.
The dye staining technique could possibly destroy what is there, so the print was photographed prior to that. Once I got that photograph back, I examined it to make sure I recorded all the characteristics.
Unash was now ready to try the dye staining process. He saturated the print with amino black, which reacts to proteins in blood and turns them dark blue or black. But the process didn't develop any further ridge detail. The evidence enhancement he had hoped for eluded him. Over the next 3 years, he examined a series of suspect prints provided by the Wichita County District Attorney's Office and compared them to the one found on Terry Sims' sneaker.
I did not identify any of the suspects that they had sent me. Reported to them that the print appears to be partial second, third joint or another area of the palm. They started sending me in some palm prints. I made those comparisons. I still did not identify the print.
At the same time, DNA testing of the biological samples from the Sims and Gibbs cases was again underway at GeneScreen in Dallas. A new technology, PCR analysis, could provide forensic scientist Judy Floyd with more conclusive results than previous tests.
The requirements were not as stringent, and therefore we were able to use this very old, very degraded DNA and obtain a genetic profile of the perpetrator.
The new DNA process eliminated all previous suspects, including Danny Wayne Laughlin, who had stood trial for the murder of Tony Gibbs a decade earlier. But it did turn up a startling piece of evidence. Biological samples recovered from both victims came from the same individual. Emerging technology and improved forensics had linked 2 apparently unrelated cases. Now there was evidence a serial killer had claimed the lives of Terry Sims and Tony Gibbs. District Attorney Barry Maka wondered if some of the other unsolved cases were related. He began taking a closer look at those files. One caught his attention, that of Ellen Blau. Maka noted that circumstances of her murder were similar to the Sims and Gibbs homicides. Down to the sneakers, laces still tied, found by her nude body. On January 12, 1999, Maka asked his investigator, John Little, to review the 3 cases and try to develop a suspect. He also gave Little a possible lead. Though the victims had been discovered in 3 different police jurisdictions, they all lived within a relatively small geographical area.
Because of the close proximity, I felt that the person responsible for their deaths had some connection to that neighborhood. And so I emphasized that to John and asked him to review the files and see if he could establish anyone with a connection to the neighborhood that may be involved in the cases.
Little began by probing for common threads among the women. It didn't take him long to find them. He noticed that they all shared several physical characteristics.
All the victims were around the same age, pretty much the same build. They were all around 5 foot tall. not much taller. They all weighed 120 pounds or less. They all seemed to have pretty much the same features.
A distinct pattern was emerging, suggesting all 3 women had been killed by the same person. Then he found a name in the Ellen Blau file, a man named Farian Wardrip. While in custody on a murder charge back in 1986, Wardrip had told police that he knew Blau. It meant nothing to the police at the time. Little wondered if it meant anything now. He learned Wardrip had worked as an orderly at the same hospital as Tony Gibbs. And records showed that he had left that job 4 days after the first victim, Terry Sims, was found murdered. As investigators dug deeper, they uncovered more connections between Wardrip and the 3 women.
Hey, John, this is right where...
He had lived in an apartment downstairs from Ellen Blau. That apartment was 2 blocks from the residence where Terry Sims was murdered. When Ellen Blau was murdered, Wardrip no longer lived at her apartment complex. He had moved to a residence across the street from the sub shop where she worked. Authorities had placed Wardrip in the neighborhood and established links between him and the victims. They were a long way from proving murder, but now they felt they were finally on the right track. A background check confirmed that Wardrip was a convicted murderer. He had confessed to killing a Wichita Falls woman in 1986. According to the records, he'd fled to Galveston, but turned himself in to police there. Sentenced to 35 years in prison, Wardrip had been paroled in 1997. During the 11 years he was incarcerated, there were no murders in Wichita Falls that were similar to those of Sims, Gibbs, or Blau.
And I felt like he was a very strong suspect. But the only way to find out for sure if he was the one responsible for these murders or not was to obtain a DNA sample.
Although circumstantial evidence pointed to Wardrip, it wasn't enough to obtain a court order to force him to provide DNA samples. Maka and Little decided to try to collect them surreptitiously. Their plan would require surveillance. Investigators contacted Wardrip's parole officer for information.
So where's he going?
They learned that Wardrip lived in nearby Alney, Texas, where he taught Sunday school and worked at a window screen company. According to the parole officer, Wardrip was being electronically monitored and was restricted to his apartment complex unless he was at work or church.
Appreciate it. Take care.
And that posed problems for investigators. For 3 days, they watched Wardrip at work behind a locked chain-link fence. He seemed to be beyond their reach. But on the 4th day, they got a break. On February 5th, 1999, the fence was unlocked and Wardrip was outside. He was with his wife, eating crackers and drinking coffee from a disposable cup. When he tossed the cup into a trash can just inside the gate, it was the opportunity they had been waiting for. The undercover investigator approached Wardrip and asked if he could get a tobacco spit cup. Wardrip told him to help himself. With that, any evidence obtained by investigators would be admissible in a court of law. He retrieved Wardrip's cup. Investigators hoped they now had their DNA sample. But would a few drops of coffee and cracker crumbs be enough to prove murder? More than a dozen years had passed since the murders of Terry Sims, Tony Gibbs, and Ellen Blau in Wichita Falls, Texas. Investigators had finally gathered physical evidence they hoped would prove Farian Wardrip was the killer. Now it was up to Gene Screen Lab in Dallas. Judy Floyd carefully swabbed the lip of the cup to collect Wardrip's saliva. When she compared that to DNA samples retrieved from the Sims and Gibbs murders, she was able to establish a match. And there was more. She discovered that Wardrip's profile was unique. He had not one, but 4 very rare markers in his genetic profile.
His profile was so rare that you would expect it to occur only one time in several thousand times the population of the Earth. And in effect, we were able to say that we have established identity with this particular individual to the evidence involved in Miss Sims and Miss Gibbs' case.
Investigators didn't stop there. At the Texas Department of Public Safety Crime Lab, Glenn Unash compared Wardrip's fingerprints to the partial print found on Terry Sims' sneaker. They matched. Besides making a positive identification, Unash could explain much more.
I can also determine how that shoe was held or when that print was left on that shoe. And it was in a direction that the defendant held the shoe or was taking the shoe off the victim's foot, somewhat similar to this, which would be consistent with pulling it off of a victim's foot.
Investigators' patience and ingenuity had paid off. It was time to take Wardrip into custody. They again enlisted the cooperation of his parole officer. On the pretense of a meeting, Wardrip was summoned to the parole office on February 13, 1999. When he arrived, police arrested Farian Wardrip and charged him with the murder of Terry Sims.
Yeah. All right.
Based on the evidence, police believe Wardrip saw Terry Sims at the door of Lisa Boone's apartment. After forcing his way inside, he tied her hands behind her back, then raped and killed her. Farian Wardrip pled guilty to the capital murders of Terry Sims, Tony Gibbs, and Ellen Blau. He was sentenced to death in the Sims case and received life terms in each of the others. Wardrip also confessed to an additional murder. In all, he had ended the lives of 5 young women. In Texas, a serial killer's guilt was contained in a disposable coffee cup. But on the West Coast, police would have to dig deeper for proof of murder. On November 7, 1988, in Sacramento, California, social worker Judy Moyes contacted Sacramento police about one of her clients, 52-year-old Bert Montoya. She said Bert had disappeared from the boarding house where she'd placed him. His landlady seemed unsure about his whereabouts. Ms. Moyes told police that Dorothea Puente's boarding house was a refuge for indigent people, many with histories of alcohol and drug abuse. It seemed ideal for Bert, a street person with no place to go. He had his own room and TV and was happy there after years of living on the streets. But after a few months, Bert started saying he wanted to leave. Judy Moyes hadn't heard from Bert in 3 months.
Bert, I have your mail.
Mrs. Puente finally explained that Bert had gone to live with his brother in Utah. That made no sense to Judy Moyes. She knew Bert Montoya didn't have any family. She asked police to look into it.
The reason I'm here today,
Officers
man,
went to interview Dorothea Puente. She seemed a gracious, grandmotherly woman, charming and eager to cooperate. She said Bert had gone to live with family in Utah. One of the residents in the boarding house corroborated the account.
I know who he is.
But as the officer was leaving, the resident slipped him a note. He wanted to talk. He told police that he'd seen some strange things at the house. Bert wasn't the only one who vanished. Another tenant, Ben Fink, had too. And there were others. But their Social Security checks kept coming. He also described a terrible odor around the boarding house. He said he'd once worked at a mortuary and recognized the smell of death.
whereabouts are these holes?
The police officer filed a missing persons report on Bert Montoya. Detective John Cabrera of the Sacramento Police Department was assigned the case. The name Dorothea Puente was familiar to him. She was known as a champion of the dispossessed.
She was highly respected for all of her charitable things that she had done to the Hispanic community. There were people that visited from other countries who came here to praise her and talk to her. And she was known in the Hispanic community as doctora, which is Spanish for doctor.
Now, Detective Cabrera requested a background check on Dorothea Puente. Based on her reputation, it wasn't what he expected. He learned that the kindly grandmother was actually only 59 years old and had a criminal history of preying on the elderly. She'd been previously convicted on multiple counts of forging Social Security checks and had served 4 years in prison. For investigators, her MO was surprising.
And she was getting these checks by putting knockout drops in these individuals' drinks. And of course, when they passed out, she took their check and signed it.
Conditions of Dorothea Puente's parole prohibited her from keeping a boarding house. That gave detectives a reason to look deeper into the situation. 4 days after Bert Montoya was reported missing, they met with Judy Moyes, hoping she could provide more information about the boarding house. She said most of the residents were poor, the forgotten elderly who exist on the fringes of society. But Dorothea Puente always had a place for them. And she had a reputation for treating tenants like family. Moyes claimed that several other social workers began to notice that their clients sometimes disappeared from the house, never to be seen again. Bert Montoya was the most recent. Perhaps some of the tenants had simply wandered off, or family members had decided to take care of them. Investigators decided to find out. Later that morning, police met with Dorothea Puente. Although they didn't have a warrant, she graciously gave them permission to conduct a search. In one of the upstairs bedrooms, police found prescription medication, a sedative in the name of Dorothy Miller.
She was related
Mrs. Puente told them it belonged to a relative who had stayed with her for a while. Investigators asked if they could dig around in her backyard. Mrs. Puente not only gave them permission, she offered to get people in to dig for them. That didn't seem the action of a person with something to hide. Investigators declined her offer and began digging themselves. After finding nothing in 3 holes, they began to think they were wasting their time. But in the 4th, they found corrosive lime, often used to mask odors and speed decay. They decided to keep digging. To their surprise, they uncovered what appeared to be a human leg bone. At a boarding house for the elderly run by 59-year-old Dorothea Puente, Sacramento police uncovered human remains.
We need to get forensics here. Yeah.
The coroner's office and a crime scene unit were dispatched to the scene. Puente agreed to accompany police to the station to make a statement. She was very cooperative and appeared genuinely shocked that bones were found in her yard. She said she had been living there for little more than a year. Perhaps the previous owner could explain the bones. But Puente's criminal past could not be ignored. Police asked her outright if she'd killed her missing tenant, 52-year-old Bert Montoya. Dorothea Puente calmly denied it. Since there was no evidence of any crime, investigators took Mrs. Puente home. The next morning, the search at the boarding house continued. As more police and excavation equipment arrived, curious onlookers and reporters began to assemble outside the house. Around 9:45, Mrs. Puente asked if she was free to go to the corner coffee shop. Since she'd been so cooperative and detectives had no proof of her involvement in any foul play, they let her go. 15 minutes later, at 10 a.m., forensic technicians uncovered a second body, wrapped in a tarp, buried under a cement slab. The condition of the tarp indicated that this body hadn't been underground very long. A police officer was dispatched to pick up Dorothea Puente at the coffee shop. She wasn't there.
We sent people over there to find out who had seen her, if anybody had talked to her, what was going on. They went over there and they had ascertained that she had got into a taxi cab and drove off.
Sacramento police traced the cab and learned it had taken her to the Stockton bus station, 50 miles away. There, they learned she boarded a bus to Los Angeles. Not knowing where she might be heading, investigators launched a nationwide search for Dorothea Puente. She was now wanted on suspicion of murder. At the boarding house, authorities continued digging. Their search for missing person Bert Montoya had unearthed human remains of one victim and a second buried corpse. Mindful of statements that several residents had disappeared, police feared Mrs. Puente's yard might conceal more ugly secrets. The second body had been discovered under a cement slab that seemed out of place. Now they realized that several more sheds, slabs, and planters were oddly situated. They soon discovered the reason for that. Laura Santos, deputy coroner of Sacramento County, supervised the search.
Under every one of these odd-seeming things, like the sink, there was a body. Under the poorly poured piece of concrete, there was a body. Next to the shed that looked hastily assembled, there was a body.
After 3 days, the dig finally came to an end. 7 bodies had been uncovered in Dorothea Puente's yard. Police were dealing with a mass murderer. It seemed impossible that 7 people could have been buried right under the neighbors' noses without anyone seeing anything. Hoping for information or witnesses, detectives began interviewing Mrs. Puente's neighbors. It was hard to find anyone with anything negative to say about her.
It was like fighting an uphill battle. The community, first of all, did not want to accept the fact that this gray-haired little woman who they loved so much and who had given so much to the community was responsible for this gruesome task of putting these people in the yard.
While investigators canvassed the neighborhood, the grim task of identifying the 7 victims, 3 men and 4 women, was underway at the Sacramento coroner's office. All the bodies were x-rayed, then forensic pathologists performed autopsies on them. The coroner started with the victim most closely matching Bert Montoya's description. She began by carefully removing layers of wrapping and documenting each. The body, like many of the others, was wrapped in a signature way that suggested a methodical but twisted mind.
Sheets wrapped with duct tape, then quilts stitched together, blankets, then more sheets, more tarps. I remember there were blue tarps on a couple of the cases, and then each layer would somehow be secured either with twine or duct tape or actually stitched with thread. And then the entire bundle perhaps duct taped together.
The wrappings concealed advanced decomposition, which made it impossible to establish a cause of death for any of the victims. But because of the circumstances, all were ruled homicide. The condition of the bodies also prevented pathologists from immediately identifying any of the victims. As Dr. Santos explains,
most people are identified by fingerprints first, next by dental records, and then by other means. 4 out of the 7 bodies were too decomposed to get decent fingerprints from. None of them had any teeth, so the usual methods that we make an identification could not be used.
the tissue samples were sent to forensic labs for further analysis. To aid in identification efforts, investigators tried to locate people who had disappeared from the boarding house. They found the brother of 55-year-old Ben Fink, one of the tenants believed to be missing. But he told police he hadn't heard from Ben in 3 months. Investigators feared Ben Fink had already been found. To build their murder case against 59-year-old Dorothea Puente, police needed physical proof linking her to the victims' deaths. Investigators went through the boarding house again. They found twine, duct tape, and a coffee can with the word "lie" written on it. Police found dozens of bottles of the prescribed sedative Dalmane. That didn't seem unusual in a boarding house full of elderly people. But investigators noticed all of the Dalmane, although prescribed by several different doctors, was in Dorothea Puente's name. As details of the investigation became public, police began hearing from witnesses who helped them reconstruct an account of Dorothea Puente's daily routine. It seemed she had a penchant for pre-dawn gardening and became very angry if interrupted. They also learned that she insisted on personally collecting the mail every day, particularly at the end of the month.
She was always there to get the mail because, of course, the mail had the checks. And she would take the checks and keep control of all the money.
Investigators learned that nobody had questioned that control. Since most of the boarding house residents had drug or alcohol problems, it seemed a logical way to keep them from lapsing into their old habits. Police believed that by persuading residents to sign their monthly checks over to her, Mrs. Puente would be assured that the money would keep coming even after the tenants disappeared. In fact, she was getting 10 to 12 federal assistance checks each month, some for people who hadn't lived at the boarding house in years. Police believed money was the motive for murder, but they still needed to find their suspect. Despite the manhunt, Dorothea Puente was still at large. On November 16th, less than a week after she fled, investigators got a tip that Dorothea Puente was at a motel in Los Angeles. An elderly man called police when he saw her picture on TV. He'd recognized her as the woman who'd struck up a conversation about his Social Security benefits.
She wanted to know things like, how much he was getting, and was he taking, full benefit of receiving the money. And of course, he was inquisitive. But she had told him that she knew how to raise his money allotment.
Even as a fugitive, she couldn't resist the opportunity to cash in. Her greed had finally caught up with her. Dorothea Puente was finally in custody. Though they believed they knew her motive for the murders, police had no physical evidence linking her to them. In addition, the victims' identities were still unknown. A latent print examiner was brought in. He compared known samples to fingerprints from 3 of the bodies. He confirmed that one of the victims was Bert Montoya. He would soon identify Ben Fink and Dorothy Miller as well. Science had made a liar of Dorothea Puente. But there remained 4 victims without names. Police had compiled a list of 60 people who had received Social Security checks at Dorothea Puente's boarding house. They tried to track down every name on that list. They found most of the people still alive, having moved out of the house for a variety of reasons. But a few were still unaccounted for. They then assembled medical records on each missing person. The files were forwarded to the Sacramento coroner's office. There, forensic pathologists began the painstaking task of comparing X-rays of each body found in the yard to medical records from each of the missing persons. They looked for distinguishing characteristics in the records that could be linked to each victim.
We did find anomalies in the bodies, abnormalities, like one person had had skull surgery and had evidence that he'd had a craniotomy. And another person had irregular characteristics of one of her clavicles, and she'd also had some mandible lower jaw fractures in the past. And using that information from the bodies, we were then able to start making comparisons with the medical records we'd obtained from this list that Social Security had provided us.
The victims had all finally been identified. But police were still missing a crucial piece of the puzzle: how they died. Until that question could be answered, authorities would have a hard time proving murder. They hoped a forensic toxicologist could give them answers. In November of 1988, police investigating the murders of 7 people at a Sacramento boarding house enlisted the aid of toxicologist William Phillips at the California Department of Justice. With no obvious cause of death, they hoped he would be able to determine whether drugs or poisons had ended the victims' lives. Phillips began by analyzing all 7 victims' tissue samples with a radioamino acid, or RIA test, which is sensitive to classes of drugs. The test results showed all of the samples contained the sedative flurazepam, which is used widely in Dalmane, the drug found at Dorothea Puente's boarding house. It is a potent sedative often prescribed for the elderly. It was the first physical evidence linking Puente to the deaths of the 7 victims. Next, Phillips subjected the samples to the tandem mass spectrometer, the only one on the West Coast at the time. The apparatus uses negative ion detection to find the characteristic profile or footprint of individual drugs. Besides detecting the presence of flurazepam or dalmane in each sample, it also measured the drug's concentration. But because the bodies had been underground for varying periods of time, those concentrations did not necessarily reflect levels present at the time of death. Some of the drug could have seeped into the ground.
The drug, dalmane, was present in all the samples, but the concentrations were so varied that no one could say whether or not the drug caused their death. But I was able to link all the samples, all the tissues, the brains, the liver tissues from all these victims to Dorothea Puente.
Investigators believed they had enough evidence to charge Dorothea Puente with the murder of her 7 tenants. Based on the evidence, police believe she would charm residents into giving her control of their money. If they were reluctant, she would invite them into her private rooms and give them a drink laced with drugs. Afterwards, she would methodically wrap the bodies and hire men to dig holes in her backyard. During her pre-dawn gardening, the 59-year-old woman managed to bury her victims. On August 15, 1993, Dorothea Puente was found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of second-degree murder. The jury was unable to reach verdicts on the other 4 charges. She was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. Serial killers are methodical, skilled at covering their tracks in order to keep killing. But even the cleverest of predators cannot avoid detection for long. Today, forensic scientists using sophisticated technology are helping police stop deadly criminals with an urge to kill again.